Okay, good morning everybody. I hope you had a nice break. Maybe one of you even read the suggested readings that I had, the Schelling book. It's a fascinating book, Micromotives and Macro Behavior, same as the other one, The Wisdom of the Crowds by James Surowiecki. Today we come back at segregation, the stuff that we ended up with last time, and today we will follow up on how segregation comes about, right? And in that context, we will mostly talk about segregation dynamics. Okay. So what I've planned for today, first I'll come back to segregation a little bit. Yeah, so just that we all remember what we talked about 3 weeks ago. And then we will jump into what I called here the segregation process. Yeah. Which is pretty much the way or the mechanisms how segregation comes about as a macro level outcome. Remember, that is what analytical sociology is all about. It's about macro level phenomena that we observe, and we are thinking about the actions and the interactions of individuals that bring these macro level patterns about. And here the key message really is that you can have something like segregation, like separation of individuals into different parts in town, or into different jobs, or into, different aspects of social life, while in fact nobody wants that. That's sort of the key message because of the segregation process. So there's sort of some social dynamics happening here, and that's what we will talk about today, where the one thing affects the other, which affects the other, which affects the other, and so on and so forth. And that brings in all the things together that we talked about so far in this course. And at the end, we have something like inequality, like segregation, or like, non-cooperative environments, while in fact nobody wants it. Okay, so that's the segregation process, and then first I have one model that I want to show to you. I think I showed it already to you earlier before the break. It's about this cocktail party model. I will come back to that. And then I'll go into more details in two models that Thomas Schelling proposed in the reading in the Micromotives and Macro Behavior book, but also in his Journal of Mathematical Sociology article that was on the reading list. That was the required reading for today. The one-dimensional and the two-dimensional segregation model. Yeah. Okay, so let's get started. First, remember segregation. It's the separation of individuals into distinct parts of society. There are other definitions out there. I think I have some more definitions, and it's something maybe it's hard for us to grasp, but it was very prevalent when it comes to race in the United States, and not until too long ago. It is still very prevalent. Probably even prevalent if I would ask you guys where you come from, what your social backgrounds are. Pretty sure that there's sort of a segregation process happening here. Yeah? That, when you are from more educated families, or when you are from more wealthy families, you're more likely to end up here. Yeah? That doesn't have to say anything about you being cleverer than other people. It's just pure fact about social inequalities and reproduction of it, and how all that works. So we find segregation with regards to not just race, but also with regards to sex, with regard to education, with regard to ethnicity. And we find it in not just according to different attributes, but also in different domains. Remember, I mentioned residential segregation. That's sort of when people studied most. It's people living in different parts of town. Right, remember the map of New York that I showed you, where there's clear the Hispanic area, there's clearly the black area, there's clearly the white area. Yeah. So, but we also find it with regards to, let's say, workplaces, occupations, and other aspects. So residential segregation, just to come back to that a little bit, like separation into different parts in town. That's sort of a recent map of New York, and it's actually pretty shocking if you think about it. We live in the 21st century, and it's still a highly segregated city, and it's just one of many examples that I could have shown you. Yeah. So segregation seems to happen, and now the question is, maybe there are some other processes that keep it alive, right? Maybe it's not about, and that's sort of the key thing here, to distinguish the macro level phenomena that we have, that's segregation, from the micro level, individual level motivation that you immediately might think about, which is discrimination. Right? So segregation is not necessarily driven by discrimination. And that's sort of the key thing here. We need to disentangle the micro from the macro, and we cannot conclude automatically from the macro to the micro. I remember there was this ecological fallacy idea that we had, Simpson's paradox, where it even reverses at the end of the day, but we cannot conclude from the macro to the micro, not only because of these things that we don't know about individuals, but also here on the top of that, I called that the analytical fallacy in one of the lectures, because of the social dynamics that happen here. Right? Because the one thing might change something else, it changes something else, and so on and so forth. Okay. So segregation in cities, residential segregation, that's sort of a classic where we find that. But when you think about this in a more abstract way, you can apply that to many other domains. You know? For example, sorting in marriages. It's a very clear thing, that people sort themselves, sort their partners. It's called assortative matching or assortative mating, right? With regards to education, for example. So I don't know, if you have a university degree, you're much more likely to get married to somebody who has a university degree, or even more, if you have a PhD, you're much more likely to get married to somebody who has a PhD. Or with regards to race, with regards to ethnicity in marriages, that happens a lot. And people study that. It's a big field. In demography, they kind of look at who marries whom, for example. There's sort of some very interesting research on that. You find it in occupations, as I already mentioned, right? It's not just space or the physical neighborhood where people congregate and come together with certain social attributes, but it's also in occupations. Peer groups, lunchrooms, when you look at who's sitting together in the restaurant, for example. I once did a study on this, funnily, actually. Dormitories, prisons, churches, chat rooms. So it's a general idea about individuals sort of sorting themselves into certain groups that you can apply to many different domains. Okay, now let's come back to the residential segregation part. And even there, when we start thinking about it, well, we should think about a whole bunch of different actors that play a role here. Right? It's not just, individuals thinking about where they want to live, but there are also so many other players here. Right? So there's buyers, sellers, renters, landlords, agents, lenders, politicians, all sorts of actors that play a role here to determine or that kind of could potentially constrain where individuals live. Think about it. When you think about where you want to, let's say you want to move, you want to go into another apartment, it matters which apartments are available, right? You cannot just say, I want to live in Dublin 4 or I want to live in Dublin 2 or something like that if there are no apartments for you available. Well, actually, that's something that we're not going to get into that, it's called vacancy chains. That means that there's a vacancy being created by somebody, and then you can move in, and what happens is that then you leave your apartment, which means you leave an opportunity for somebody else to move in your current apartment. That's sort of a vacancy that you created, and then you have a chain of these vacancies, and that kind of trickles out. So also some very interesting research, but it shows you that there are other factors that play a role here. What we're going to do now, we will focus on the individuals who decide where to move. So we will leave these other constraints that obviously matter. They obviously matter. We leave them out because even when we just look at the individuals who think about where they could live or where they would want to move or where they don't like to live, we see that segregation emerges even though those individuals are not discriminating in their behavior. So I have a definition again, I already brought that up before. Segregation is the separation of individuals into distinct parts of social life. I hope that by now we all understand what it is. Think of residential segregation, that may be the most obvious. There's sort of certain areas of town where people with certain ethnic groups tend to congregate. So that's a macro phenomena. That's something that we observe, and we can observe it in other contexts as well. So what would be a common sense explanation for that? Yeah? If you would have not come to this class by accident on a Tuesday morning, or whatever, what would have been an explanation you would have come up with? And it's pretty straightforward. Common sense explanation is there is segregation because people don't like each other, right? That's sort of what we immediately think about. We observe this pattern, and many people are unable to distinguish between the broader macro level pattern and the micro level motives and actions that kind of play a role here. But it's crucially important. If there's one really important thing to take out of this whole course, it's that you need to distinguish these things, because you cannot conclude from the one to the other. But if you wouldn't know that, you could say, okay, there is segregation because people don't like each other. Well, as I will show you, this is actually not true. Empirically, this does not hold. If that would be the case, other things we should find other things as well that we don't find. Remember about how I talked about explanations at the beginning, one of the first courses, one of the first classes. I talked about Jon Elster's hypothetical deductive model. You have an explanation, and you think about what are the implications of my explanation, if that is true. And also you think about alternative explanations that could equally well explain what you want to explain. And then you think about what are the implications of my alternative explanations. So if this other thing would explain what I'm thinking, what it actually does explain it, then what else should be true, right? And that's sort of how we can go about that. And when we think about this common sense theory, if that is true, if it is true that there is segregation because people don't like each other, what else should be true? Well, then can we say, if that would be true, things with higher tolerance, where people are less discriminating in their behaviors towards others, they don't have a problem with being surrounded with people of another race or of another ethnic group, there should be less segregation. Right? That makes sense. If that's sort of the thing that drives it, that people don't like each other and that kind of leads to segregation, that's sort of now, I don't know, my candidate explanation that I have for this phenomena that I have on the other side, which is a segregation thingy, right? And then I think about, this is my candidate explanation. And then I think, okay, if that is true, what else would be true? And that's how we go about these things. This is how social science works. You have a candidate explanation, and you think about, if that is true, well, I don't know, it's far too simple to just say that and just to say, okay, and maybe even provide some evidence for that. You need to think about other implications of your most favored explanations, and then look at these other implications. And if they still hold, if they are there, then I'm buying into your argument much more than if you would not have shown me these alternative implications. But if these alternative implications are not true, well, then your candidate explanation can't be right. That's sort of the logic that goes here. So if there is segregation because people don't like each other, we would observe less segregation in more tolerant cities. That's the idea. Another implication. If segregation is due to people not liking each other, then the percentage, now I'm talking about residential segregation here, the percentage of whites approving integration increases. Well, when the percentage of whites approving integration increases, then residential segregation decreases. Yeah? So the first one is sort of the general attribute about cities being more tolerant, and the other one is just about individuals being favoring integration. So now I'll show you some data. This is some old data, but we're talking about, I don't know, when segregation was really prevalent. And this is sort of put together from different sources, from publication of James Coleman, but also Sheetsley. And when we look at this table, well, let me walk you through. First of all, we have sort of different rows, different years, right? 1940 up to 1968. This is sort of where we have the data points. This is data from the United States. Yeah? So this is all data about the United States, and it's separated into the North and the South. Yeah? So we have sort of here two columns for the South and two columns for the North of the United States. Why is it separated with that? Well, I remember there was a civil war at some point, right? Or sort of very different attitudes about slavery. I don't know. There's still good arguments that there are very different ideas about maybe segregation, or maybe discrimination in different parts in the United States. So let's look closer at that. First of all, let's look at the first column here that we have. This is sort of residential segregation. This is sort of an indices. There are many different ways how to measure segregation. This one measures the percentage of blacks who would have to move in order to achieve residential homogenization by a race. Yeah? So actually, this is pretty high. If you look at it, 85% of black people would have to move into another neighborhood. Well, we're talking about the 1940s, 1950s. Now you actually see how much segregation there was. Would have to move to get a proper mixing. Yeah? That's sort of the idea here. So these numbers are really, really high. And they are high for both the South and the North. Yeah? Okay, now let's remember these alternative explanations or these alternative implications that we had. First, we said that in more tolerant cities or in more tolerant areas, there should be less segregation. Okay, let's look at that. Well, how can we measure tolerance? Here we have the second column that kind of says the percentage of whites approving residential segregation. Yeah? So the higher residential integration. So the lower these numbers are, the more racist the people are. And the more racist the whites are. So you can see, in the 1940s, they were pretty racist, actually. And then, fortunately, they became more tolerant, and nowadays the numbers would be very different. I would be very surprised if that wouldn't be completely different by now. But so you see, people got more tolerant over time. Now that's sort of what we take out of this column, and that's what we take out of this column. Okay, now let's compare the South and the North column with each other when it comes to both residential segregation and when it comes to approval of residential integration. First of all, when we compare this column to this column, well, there's not much of a difference here, right? In 1940, there's actually even more segregation in the North. In the 1950s, it's about the same thing. Well, by 1960s, there's some more segregation in the South than in the North, but in both, it is pretty high. Yeah. Okay. Now let's compare the columns about approval of residential integration. Now you see there's actually a big difference. It's a big difference. Now actually we're picking up what I had suggested earlier, that in the South, at least in the 1940s and 1950s, 1960s, people in the States were much more racist. Well, there's no surprise. That's sort of what we would have thought, but we would find. But it's very clear in the data. But now the interesting thing for us is, remember what I said, if it is about people not liking each other that causes segregation, then there should be less segregation in parts of the city or in parts of the world, in parts of a country where people approve more of residential integration. Do we find that here? Well, in the North, people are only half as racist or even less than in the South, but we still find approximately same levels of segregation. You see how suddenly sort of our connection, our common sense theory doesn't make sense anymore, that it is about that it's only about discrimination that leads to the phenomena of residential segregation that we have at the end. So the first implication that we had here is that, if that would be true, high tolerance cities would have lower segregation than low tolerance cities. We don't find that. There's an equal amount of segregation in the north and the south, although in the north people are much more tolerant in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. So we don't find that. No. So that's sort of a case where the implication that our favorite explanation suggests does not hold. Right? Or with empirical data we cannot confirm that. So that means we should rethink about our explanation to begin with. The second suggestion that we have here is that, basically it says that when people become more tolerant, segregation should go down. That's sort of what the second implication here suggests, right? The first one, you have different parts of the world and they are more or less discriminatory in their behavior. There should be more or less segregation. The second one says that, now let's take the world as it is. If people become more tolerant, segregation should go down. That's the second implication of our common sense theory. Now let's look at this data again. Well, people become more tolerant within 20 years. From the 1940s, only 12% of the people approve in the South residential integration, while 20 years later, it's almost 40%. Same thing for the North, right? At the beginning in the 1940s, only 40% approve of mixing when it comes to housing, residential integration. And 20 years later, it's almost 70%. What would we expect? Remember, if people become more tolerant, then segregation should go down. If it is all about tolerance and discriminatory behavior and so on. But actually we observe for the South, we observe the opposite. There's more residential segregation as time passes. Yeah? In 1940, there's 85% blacks would have to move, and in 1960, it's 90%. So there's more segregation. When we look at the North, well, it goes up a little and then it goes down a little, but there's not a huge change that mirrors that suddenly that people become much more tolerant. So you see, again we refuted an implication of our most favored explanation. It's not true. We cannot find empirical support for our suggestion that we had in the first instance. So our common sense theory, that we had here, that there is segregation because people don't like each other, we don't have empirical evidence for it. I just showed you why. Right? Because the implications that would follow from that are not true. So, not to say that these things don't matter at all. I think actually they do matter, right? And actually you do need to have some sort of, if you live in a world where there are no preferences at all, but somehow it doesn't seem to be that simple, right? There seems to be something else going on. So we can ask the question, why is there segregation and why does it not go away when people become more tolerant? Okay. Now the answer that Thomas Schelling suggested, and remember he's the guy who won the Nobel Prize, not for that, but he could have equally won it for that, in my opinion. It's about looking at the segregation process. And you have a definition by Brook and Mayer, but first of all they have their own segregation definition. Let me read it out. So they say segregation is the non-random allocation of people who belong to different groups into social positions and the associated social and physical distances between groups. Okay, and now they introduce the segregation process. They say segregation per se is a static property of a population. Okay? Macro-level phenomena that we observe. It's a static property of a population. Whereas segregation processes are the actions that create and sustain segregation. So now we are distinguishing the thing that we actually do observe at the end of the day and the process, how it comes about. And this should ring a bell. This is pretty much what analytical sociology suggests, right? We have segregation at the one end here, and now the idea is, okay, let's think about the process, how this comes about. In analytical sociology, we think about the actions and the interactions of individuals that come together. Let me show up this graph again. Remember, it's how, not just looking at the different wheels, but looking at how they are connected with each other and how together they bring about something like segregation. Okay, so now let's try to apply that idea to segregation and to then look at what we call segregation dynamics. Well, this all starts with you still need to have some way of without individuals acting in a certain way or having certain preferences for something, you would remain in a static world. Right? Nobody would do anything. And when we talk about segregation, people looked at different aspects of this. It could be that individuals have preferences for their own groups. It could be that there are economic inequalities combined with price differences. Think about, actually it used to be like that, that black and whites were rich and poor, and that led to whites living in certain areas of town and blacks living in another area of town. So it's not necessarily about discrimination, but about something else, right? Or there could be, discrimination and racial steering by, for example, real estate agents. It's also something that happened to a large degree and still happens. Actually, some colleagues of mine do some very fascinating research about this, where they apply for housing or they apply for jobs. I think this is really cool work where they submit their resumes, their CVs. Actually, they submit fake resumes. They submit hundreds, 200s fake resumes to jobs, and it's pretty much the same CV, but they slightly change the name. Right? They give it an Arabic-sounding name, or they give them a South American-sounding name, while everything else is sort of comparable. And then they actually pick up how many times they get invited. This fake resume, this fake candidate gets invited for an interview. And that's another way to detect discrimination and to study that. But anyway, the key thing here for us is when these feedback loops come into play, right? So that individuals behaving in a certain way leads to others behaving in a certain way, leading to others behaving in a certain way, and so on and so forth. So, we had this, in the session before the break, we talked about, some echo chambers that you can think about, where people hear sort of similar things again and again and again, and that ultimately changes what they think how the world looks like, or it changes how they behave in the world, and so on. So we had already talked about that before. But that's sort of the thing where now our intuition comes in, now our analytical sociology intuition comes in to understand the macro level phenomena that we have, something like inequality, something like segregation. Maybe there are some feedback loops happening here that we need to consider. Okay, why can we think about that? Well, now hopefully you see how some of the other lectures that we had before kind of put a picture together. Remember, we talked about social influence to a great length. We talked about threshold effects to a great length, where some individuals start to riot when others riot, or some individuals go and take out their money from the bank when other people do that, and then others do that, and that kind of leads to a phenomenon at the end of the day, right? So to some degree, this is, I think, very much in something that we observe in the social world. Not to say that everything is dynamic, not to say that everything, that these kind of dynamics where, the macro level phenomena is vastly different from individual level motives or behavior. Not to say that that always holds, but we observe it many times. Right? And surprisingly, many of my colleagues don't think about that. It's something that really strikes me. How can we understand the social world without fully appreciating that individuals are embedded in a social context. And that while being in there, they also change their social context. It's a very dynamic thing. And you can even, I don't know, I talked with one guy who actually studies how we communicate. Just think about and notice how you communicate with others, how you ascribe meaning to things, how you eventually converge on what you both think, what you know, what you talk about. There's so much dynamic happening in there. That kinds of, once you start looking at it, you actually see it in so many aspects of your life. Okay, but now coming back to segregation, I want to first show you one little toy example before I get into the models that Schelling suggested. So the first model I want to show to you is sort of, it's sort of like a little toy example of a cocktail party. Yeah, so that's sort of a little toy example of a cocktail party. I think I showed that model to you, and I will talk more about models in general in a second. But we've all been in these situations. You are at a party, at a house party, or I don't know, after Easter party, coming back to school party, wherever you are, and the different groups. The men and the women, male and female, separated. They stand together in different groups, and maybe you've been in that situation that it becomes slightly uncomfortable, or maybe sort of the situation, maybe the conversation just moves into a very different area, and you're just not that interested in that anymore when there are too many individuals of the opposite sex there, right? So imagine that I don't know, you couldn't care less about sports, and suddenly you're surrounded by 10 huge guys who talk about, I don't know, rugby or something else, and you just can't be bothered. You just walk somewhere else, right? Or the same thing, I don't know, let's imagine, I don't know, you're standing there in a group with lots of girls, and they start talking about their eyelashes or something else. So I don't know, it could be something completely different as well. The point that I want to convey here now is that maybe because of the composition of the sexes here, individuals move elsewhere. Okay, and now what happens is, now this is sort of this is a toy model, right? This is very abstract. To bring home a point about this dynamics. Now I kind of artificially, this is just completely randomly set up, a whole bunch of different groups. There you see males and females, and this is sort of how they stand together in their little groups, right? And now we just impose a very little rule, very simple rule, that you want to have at least 50% or that you're tolerant with up to 50% of the opposite sex. Or we could change that. Let's say you're tolerant with up to, I don't know, 70% of the opposite sex. Yeah? Let's have it like that. And then we can, in these models, and actually this is what we call agent-based modeling, right? Because we have agents and we model their behavior to generate the macro-level outcomes that we observe. And now what happened, now we identify the individuals that are unhappy with that situation, with that scenario, and we let them move somewhere else. Let me change the primary configuration here. Okay, so what happens, well, depending on this parameter, how I change that, but the main story is that very quickly, groups move apart, although they might actually be tolerant, or although they actually might be fine with 50% mixes or even more and so on, but they move apart and they kind of stand in their own little groups. The explanation for that is, come back to that, one individual moving changes the situation for the group where this person left, but it also changes the situation for the group where this person enters, right? And then maybe somebody else becomes unhappy because of that, right? And that's a scenario that surely you notice or you remember. I don't know, you're somewhere at a party and there's weird people suddenly joining your group, and then, I don't know, you go to the kitchen and get another drink or something. Yeah. Okay, but that's just one toy example, and that's the main contribution of Thomas Schelling here in his Micromotives and Macrobehavior book, but also in the article in the Journal of Mathematical Sociology, where he made us think about these kind of models, right? Where we look at individual behaviors and how this affects others, which then makes them behave in a certain way, which then affects others again, and so on and so forth. And this is now where these models come into play. So what are these models? Yeah. When you haven't dealt with these with models before, it's kind of a little strange. You think, what is this guy doing? And they're sort of very artificial setup, and there's some blue and some pink dots, and what should that represent? Obviously, that's not the real world, right? So a model is by definition a simplification of the world. A model is a simplification of the world. And when we look at the social world, or in the sciences and the social sciences, let's face it, we don't know why the world works the way it works. We don't. How should we know? Nobody tells us. I don't know. The best thing we can do is have certain ideas, have certain theories about what we think how the social world works. Right? And that's what we have. We built basically a model that reproduces what we observe in the real world. And by building that model, we can understand the ingredients that we put into this model. We don't understand the ingredients of the real world. We don't see that, right? But we can understand, we can grasp what we put in our model. And then we kind of try to build a model, or there are different ways of using a model. One way is to use a model to replicate the real world as closely as possible, right? And then we know, okay, well, apparently this factor that I put into my model seems to play an important role in generating data that looks like the real world. And this is sort of where models come into play, to match the observations that we have in the real world. It's still a model, right? It's still a model. But it's a model that we can understand and where we know the ingredients, and when we can say, okay, this model seems to replicate the real world very closely. So this is how the thinking goes. We don't know why the world works the way it works. We only know why our model works the way it works. And when we see that our model replicates the real world, we have a high confidence. We have a good. We have a grasp of what we think what could make the world tick the way it ticks. Sometimes a little hard to understand how these models work, right? And that's sort of, I don't know. You think you might learn about how the real world works, but we don't know. We don't know. And that even I don't know, in the sciences, when they say, I don't know, this is our model of gravity and so on, how should they know that there's sort of something like space-time, that it's curved, and this is sort of Einstein's theory of relativity? How do they know? Well, it's still a model. It's a model, but the model sort of seems to have features and make predictions about the real world that we can go and actually test. I remember, I don't know, in your first year, I hope somebody talked to you about that, about falsifiability. Karl Popper, we can never show that something is true. We can only show that something is not true. We can disprove theories, but we can never actually prove them. We can only find evidence that kind of makes us be more confident in the theory, but we are never certain that it's really like that. While if something is wrong, we are absolutely certain by that. So that's, it comes from the problem of induction, deduction, induction, Karl Popper, falsifiability, philosophy of social sciences. So that's a model. Yeah? And one way to use models is to replicate the real world. A second way to use models is to look at them in a very abstract sense, to understand something like the actions and the interactions of individuals. And this is sort of now where our cocktail party model comes into play, and where also later on our segregation models come into play. Okay, but instead of jumping into that, we are running out of time. I would suggest that I'm going to talk about that the next time, because it is important to understand these segregation dynamics. So we will come back to that, and we will look at some more models that Jenning suggested. Okay, then let's stop now here. I don't want to start this now and have this half-heartedly. Okay, thanks.